The bullet that grazed Penelope Whitmore's shoulder in the autumn of 1877 didn't hurt nearly as much as the silence that had wrapped around her heart for the past 23 years. She stood in the general store in Riverton, Wyoming Territory, clutching a bolt of fabric against her chest while blood seeped through her worn calico dress. The attempted robbery had lasted less than 3 minutes. Two masked men had burst through the door demanding the contents of the cash register, fired wildly when old Mr. Henderson reached for something beneath the counter, and fled when they heard the marshal's whistle outside. The stray bullet had barely grazed her, but Penelope stood frozen in place, her gray eyes wide and vacant, making no sound at all. "Miss Whitmore, you've been shot." Mrs. Henderson rushed toward her, hands fluttering. "Someone fetch Doc Morrison." Penelope looked down at her shoulder with the same detached expression she wore for everything in life. The pain registered somewhere distant, like it was happening to someone else entirely. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, just as no laughter, no cries, no sounds of joy or sorrow had ever really escaped her lips in any meaningful way. She could speak when necessary, quiet and measured, but emotions remained locked somewhere deep inside where even she couldn't reach them. The door burst open again, and this time it wasn't bandits, but a mountain of a man who had to duck to clear the frame. Josiah Jensen had been in town less than a week, trading pelts and restocking supplies, before heading back into the high country where he spent most of his days. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and his buckskin shirt strained against muscles built from years of surviving in the wilderness. His jaw was sharp beneath a thick beard, and his eyes were the color of a mountain storm. "Heard shots," he said, his voice a deep rumble. Then those storm-colored eyes landed on Penelope and the blood spreading across her shoulder. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "I'm fine," Penelope whispered, the words automatic and empty. "You're bleeding." Josiah's hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined the wound. "Looks like it went clean through the flesh. You're lucky." Penelope didn't feel lucky. She didn't feel much of anything, which was precisely the problem that had plagued her since childhood. While other girls had giggled and cried and squealed with delight, Penelope had watched from behind an invisible wall, wondering what it felt like to be so alive. "Let me take you to the doctor." Josiah was already scooping her up before she could protest, cradling her against his broad chest as if she weighed nothing at all. The movement should have startled her, should have made her cry out, but she simply let herself be carried, studying his profile with quiet curiosity. "I can walk," she said softly. "Maybe, but you won't." There was something in his tone that suggested arguing would be pointless. Penelope found she didn't mind. Doc Morrison's office was 2 buildings down, and Josiah shouldered through that door as well, bellowing for the doctor before he'd even fully entered. Doc Morrison appeared from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth, his gray eyebrows shooting up at the sight of the massive mountain man carrying the silent Whitmore girl. "Set her on the table there." "What happened?" "Robbery at Henderson's store. Bullet grazed her shoulder." Josiah deposited Penelope on the examination table with care, but he didn't step away. He stood close, watching as Doc Morrison cut away the fabric around the wound. "You're right, went straight through. Missed anything important. You're a fortunate young lady, Miss Whitmore." Doc Morrison set about cleaning the wound, and Penelope sat perfectly still, her face betraying nothing of the pain she must have felt. Most folks would be crying or carrying on. "You've got steel in you." It wasn't steel. Penelope knew that. It was emptiness, a vast hollow space where feelings should have lived. Josiah was frowning at her, she noticed. His eyes had narrowed, studying her face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." Penelope answered honestly, because it did. She simply couldn't express it the way others did. But you don't cry. No. Ever? She met his gaze fully for the first time. No, not ever. Something shifted in Josiah's expression, a flicker of understanding or perhaps recognition. He nodded slowly and finally stepped back to give Doc Morrison room to work. But he didn't leave, and Penelope found herself grateful for his presence even if she couldn't quite explain why. The doctor bandaged her shoulder and gave her instructions for keeping the wound clean. He refused payment, saying Henderson would cover it since it happened in his store during the robbery. Penelope thanked him quietly and slid off the table, testing her arm. It was stiff and sore but functional. Josiah was waiting by the door. "Where are you staying?" "I have a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, 3 streets over. I'll walk you there." Again, it wasn't a question or an offer but a statement of fact. Penelope found herself accepting his escort without protest. They walked through the dusty streets of Riverton as the afternoon sun beat down from a cloudless Wyoming sky. The town was growing, buildings springing up to accommodate the miners and ranchers and railroad workers who'd been flooding into the territory. Penelope had arrived 6 months ago from Ohio, fleeing a life that had never quite fit, hoping the West might offer something different. So far, it had offered only the same loneliness in a new location. "You have family here?" Josiah asked as they walked. "No, I came alone." "That's brave." Penelope considered this. "Or foolish, I haven't decided which yet." The corner of Josiah's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. "What brought you to Riverton?" "I needed to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. This seemed as good a place as any." She glanced up at him. "What about you?" "You don't seem like a town person." "I'm not. I live up in the mountains, about 2 days' ride north. I come down every few months for supplies and to trade pelts. That's all. Alone, always alone." There was no sadness in his voice, just fact. They reached the boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with a wraparound porch. Mrs. Patterson was sweeping the steps and looked up with interest at the sight of Penelope accompanied by the enormous mountain man. Her eyes widened at the sight of the bandage. "Good heavens, what happened to you?" Penelope explained briefly while Mrs. Patterson clucked her tongue and insisted she go straight to bed. Josiah stood at the bottom of the porch steps, his hat in his hands, and Penelope realized he'd removed it at some point during their walk. His hair was even longer than she'd thought, and she had the strangest urge to know what it felt like. "Thank you," she said to him, "for your help." It was nothing. But he was still looking at her with that puzzled expression, as if she were a track he couldn't quite identify. "Miss Whitmore, can I ask you something?" "Penelope. You can call me Penelope." "Penelope." Her name sounded different in his deep voice, like something worth saying. "Have you ever laughed out loud, I mean? A real laugh?" The question should have been intrusive or rude, but coming from him it felt genuine. Penelope thought about lying, about brushing it off with a deflection, but something about Josiah made her want to be honest. "No, I don't think I ever have." He nodded slowly, his storm-gray eyes never leaving hers. "I'm going to change that." Before she could ask what he meant, he'd settled his hat back on his head, tipped it to Mrs. Patterson, and strode away down the street. Penelope watched him go, one hand absently touching her bandaged shoulder, wondering if she'd imagined the entire encounter. The next morning, Penelope woke to find a small carved wooden bird sitting on her windowsill. It was beautiful, made from what looked like pine, the details so intricate she could see individual feathers. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. There was no note, but somehow she knew it was from Josiah. She found him at the livery stable, brushing down a massive roan horse that looked only slightly less intimidating than its owner. He glanced up when she approached, and she held up the bird. "This is beautiful. Thank you. But why? Josiah set down the brush and walked over to her. I carved it last night. Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about you standing in that store with a bullet in your shoulder and not making a sound. Not because you're brave, though maybe you are, but because you don't know how. He gestured to the bird. That's a mountain bluebird. Prettiest sound in the high country. I thought you should have one. Penelope looked down at the carved bird, feeling something unfamiliar stir in her chest. I don't understand. You said you've never laughed out loud. I've decided I want to hear that sound, so I'm going to make it happen. He said it with the same certainty he'd said everything else, as if it were already decided and she simply hadn't caught up yet. That's impossible. People have been trying to make me laugh or cry or show any real feeling my whole life. My mother thought I was broken. The doctors in Ohio said it was just my temperament. Penelope's fingers tightened around the wooden bird. You can't fix what's not there. Maybe it is there. Maybe it just needs the right key. Josiah picked up an apple from a nearby barrel and bit into it, studying her. How long are you planning to stay in Riverton? I have no plans to leave. I work at the schoolhouse, helping the teacher with the younger children. It's enough. Is it? No one had ever asked her that before. Everyone assumed that quiet, emotionless Penelope was content with her quiet, emotionless life. The question hung in the air between them, demanding an honest answer. I don't know what else to want, she finally said. Josiah tossed the apple core into the stable yard where chickens immediately swarmed it. I'm staying in town for another week. Every day I'm going to try something different. If by the end of that week I haven't made you laugh, I'll head back to the mountains and leave you be. Deal. Penelope should have said no. She should have explained that this was a waste of his time, that she was a lost cause, that he should save his energy for something possible. But standing there in the morning light, holding a wooden bird carved by hands that could probably snap a man in half, but had chosen to create something delicate instead, she found herself nodding. Deal. Josiah's face broke into a genuine smile, and Penelope was struck by how it transformed him from intimidating to something else entirely. Something warm and alive and magnetic. Good. Be ready after you finish at the schoolhouse. I'll be waiting. He was true to his word. When Penelope emerged from the small building that served as Riverton's schoolhouse that afternoon, Josiah was leaning against the fence, looking utterly out of place among the children running past him. He'd cleaned up, she noticed, his hair tied back and his buckskin shirt replaced with a simple cotton one that still strained against his muscular frame. Where are we going? She asked. You'll see. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His forearm was solid as oak beneath her fingers. He led her to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. A wagon waited there, hitched to his roan horse and another sturdy mare. In the back of the wagon, Penelope could see blankets and what looked like a picnic basket. I figured you spend all day inside with children. Thought you might like some space and quiet. Josiah helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steady at her waist. Her shoulder twinged slightly, but it was healing well. They drove out onto the plains, the town shrinking behind them until it was just a cluster of buildings against the vast Wyoming landscape. The autumn grass rippled in waves under the wind, gold and amber in the afternoon light. Josiah didn't speak much as he drove, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came from someone who was used to being alone, but didn't mind sharing space with another person. He stopped the wagon near a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. The leaves were turning yellow, rustling overhead with a sound like whispered secrets. Josiah jumped down and came around to help Penelope, lifting her down with the same easy strength he'd shown when carrying her to the doctor. "This is one of my favorite spots when I come down from the mountains," he said, spreading a blanket on the grass near the creek. "It's still wild enough to feel free, but close enough to town that you're not in danger." Penelope sat down on the blanket, smoothing her skirts around her. Her shoulder was aching now, but she ignored it. "It's beautiful." "It is." But when she looked over, Josiah was watching her instead of the landscape. He seemed to catch himself and turned to the basket, pulling out bread and cheese and dried meat. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can put together a decent meal when I need to." They ate, and Josiah started talking. He told her about the mountains, about tracking elk through snow so deep it came up to his chest, about the feeling of standing on a peak and seeing nothing but wilderness in every direction. He talked about the silence up there, how it was different from the silence in town, how it was full of small sounds once you learned to listen. Bird calls and wind through pine trees and the distant howl of wolves. Penelope found herself leaning forward, caught up in his stories despite herself. She could picture it all so clearly, the world he described. A world where being quiet wasn't strange, where solitude was natural rather than something to be fixed. "Why do you live alone?" she asked when he paused. Josiah was quiet for a moment, tearing off a piece of bread and tossing it into the creek. A fish rose to investigate. "I was married once, long time ago before I came west. Her name was Sarah. She died of fever the winter after we were wed." His voice was matter of fact, but Penelope heard the old pain underneath. "After that, I couldn't stand being around people anymore. Everyone wanted me to move on, to marry again, to act like life could just continue. So I left. Came out here where nobody expected anything from me." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly. "It was 10 years ago. I've made peace with it." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "But I remember what it was like to feel everything too much. After Sarah died, I felt like I was drowning in feeling. Grief and anger and loss, all of it crushing me. Maybe that's why I recognized what I saw in you. You're the opposite. Not too much feeling, but none at all." "Not none," Penelope corrected quietly. "I do feel things. I just can't seem to show them. It's like there's a wall between what's inside and what I can express. I can tell you that something is beautiful, but I can't make my face show joy. I can know that something is sad, but no tears will come. It's like being trapped inside myself." Josiah reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, completely engulfing her smaller hand. "Then we'll find a way to break down that wall." "Why do you care?" The question escaped before Penelope could stop it. "You don't know me. After this week, you'll go back to your mountains and I'll still be here, just as broken as before." "Maybe I care because I know what it's like to be broken in a different way. Maybe I care because when I look at you, I see someone who's trying even though she thinks it's hopeless. Or maybe," he squeezed her hand gently, "I just want to hear you laugh because I think it would be the most beautiful sound in the world." Something cracked inside Penelope's chest, a tiny fissure in the wall he described. It wasn't laughter, not yet, but it was something. A warmth, a lightness, a flutter of possibility. They stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible. Josiah packed up the remains of their meal and helped Penelope back into the wagon. On the ride back to town, she found herself sitting closer to him than strictly necessary, their shoulders brushing with each bump in the rough road. At the boarding house, Josiah walked her to the door. Mrs. Patterson was conspicuously absent, though Penelope suspected she was watching from somewhere inside. "Thank you for today," Penelope said. "I enjoyed it. Good. Tomorrow, something different." "What? If I told you, it wouldn't be a surprise." He tipped his hat to her and headed back to the wagon. Penelope watched him go, Her hand pressed against her chest where that crack in the wall seemed to be widening, letting in light she hadn't known she was missing. The next day, Josiah was waiting for her again after school, but this time he wasn't alone. He'd somehow acquired a puppy, a squirming ball of brown and white fur that was trying its best to lick his face while he held it at arm's length. "What is that?" Penelope asked, though the answer was obvious. "This is part 2 of my plan. Everyone smiles at puppies. It's a universal truth." He held the creature out to her, and Penelope automatically took it, feeling the warm weight settle into her arms. The puppy immediately started licking her chin, its tail wagging so hard its entire body wiggled. Penelope looked down at the animal. It was objectively adorable, all floppy ears and oversized paws. She could recognize that intellectually. She waited for the smile, for the laugh, for any outward expression of the sweetness she was witnessing. Nothing came. The puppy didn't seem to care. It just kept licking her face, making small huffing sounds of puppy joy. "I don't think it's working," Penelope said quietly, disappointment coloring her voice. The disappointment itself was notable. That she could feel it so clearly, even if she couldn't show it, meant something. Josiah stepped closer, reaching out to scratch the puppy's ears. "Maybe not. But you're holding it like you don't want to let go. That's something." He was right. Penelope's arms had tightened around the puppy without her conscious decision. It felt good to hold something warm and alive, to feel its heartbeat against her chest. "Where did you get it?" "Miller's dog had a litter last month. He was happy to let me borrow one for the afternoon. Thought maybe we could take it for a walk, let it run around." They spent the afternoon on the prairie again, this time with the puppy bounding through the grass, pouncing on grasshoppers and tumbling over its own feet. Josiah threw sticks, and the puppy would charge after them with more enthusiasm than skill, often running right past the stick and having to circle back. Penelope sat on the blanket, watching the puppy's antics. She could feel something building inside her, a pressure that wanted to escape. The puppy was funny, objectively hilarious in its clumsy excitement. She wanted to laugh. She could sense the laugh somewhere inside her trying to find its way out. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came. Just a soft exhale, maybe the ghost of what a laugh should be, but not the real thing. Josiah dropped down onto the blanket beside her, slightly out of breath from playing with the puppy. "You felt it though, didn't you? The almost laugh." "How did you know?" "Your eyes. They lit up for just a second, like a door opening and then closing again." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "We're getting closer." The puppy collapsed between them, exhausted from its adventures, and promptly fell asleep. Penelope stroked its soft fur absently, very aware of how close Josiah was sitting, how she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Tell me about Ohio," he said. "What was your life like there?" Penelope was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "Lonely. My parents were good people, but they didn't understand me. I was an only child, and I think my mother especially wanted a daughter who would giggle with her friends and cry at weddings and express all the emotions mothers expect from daughters. Instead, she got me. Silent, strange Penelope who read books at parties and couldn't even cry at her own grandfather's funeral. Did you love your grandfather? Yes, very much. That's what made it worse. I felt the grief, Josiah. It was like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold. But no tears would come, and everyone thought I didn't care. People stopped inviting me places. I had no real friends. By the time I was 20, I knew I had to leave. Start over somewhere where no one knew the strange Whitmore girl. And has it been better here?" Penelope looked around at the vast prairie, the endless sky. "Different. Not better or worse, just different. At least here I can be lonely in a place that feels big enough to contain it." Josiah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "You don't have to be lonely." "Not anymore." She turned to look at him, this mountain of a man who decided for some unfathomable reason that she was worth his time and effort. "You'll leave in a few days, back to your mountains. Maybe, or maybe I'll find a reason to stay." His hand covered hers where it rested on the puppy's fur. "I'm not much for town life, Penelope, but I'm finding I'm not as fond of being alone as I thought, not when there's someone worth staying for." The crack in the wall widened a little more, and Penelope felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of something deeper. Something that felt like it might break her open entirely if she let it. They returned the puppy as the sun was setting. Miller delighted to report that his wife would be pleased one of the puppies had gotten so much exercise. Josiah walked Penelope back to the boarding house, neither of them speaking much, but the silence was comfortable, companionable. At her door, Josiah caught her hand before she could go inside. Tomorrow, Penelope agreed. Day 3 brought dancing. The church was holding a social, and Josiah had somehow convinced Penelope to attend. She'd protested that she didn't dance, had never danced, but he'd simply said that was fine because he'd teach her. The church hall was decorated with paper streamers and lit by dozens of candles. A small group of musicians played in the corner, fiddle and guitar creating lively melodies that had couples spinning across the floor. Penelope stood against the wall, watching with her usual quiet observation, cataloging the smiles and laughter that seemed to come so easily to everyone else. Josiah appeared beside her with 2 cups of punch. He'd clearly made an effort, his hair neatly brushed and tied back, his shirt clean and only slightly too tight across his shoulders. Several young women in the room had already cast interested glances his way, but his attention was entirely on Penelope. "You ready?" he asked, setting down the cups. "I don't know the steps." "Doesn't matter, just follow me." He took her hand and led her onto the floor before she could protest further. The musicians started a waltz, and Josiah placed one large hand on her waist, his other hand engulfing hers. "Put your hand on my shoulder," he instructed, and Penelope complied, feeling the solid muscle beneath her palm. "Now just step with me. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. His voice was low, meant only for her ears, and he guided her through the basic steps with surprising grace for such a large man. Penelope stumbled at first, self-conscious and awkward, but Josiah was patient. He didn't seem to care when she stepped on his feet or when she lost the rhythm. He just smiled down at her and kept counting softly until gradually, hesitantly, she began to catch on. "There you go," he murmured as they made it through a full rotation without incident. "You're a natural." "I'm terrible," Penelope corrected, but there was no heat in it. "You're learning. That's different." He spun her carefully, and Penelope felt a small thrill at the movement, at the way the room blurred around her while Josiah remained solid and steady at the center of her vision. They danced 3 more songs, and by the end, Penelope had almost forgotten to be self-conscious. She was too focused on the feeling of Josiah's hand on her waist, the warmth of his body close to hers, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. During a break in the music, they stepped outside for air. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Penelope leaned against the church wall, slightly breathless, very aware that her heart was beating faster than the dancing alone could account for. "Did you feel it?" Josiah asked, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "Joy, even just for a moment. I felt something," Penelope admitted. "It was like being dizzy, but in a good way. Like the world was spinning, and I was spinning with it instead of just watching from the outside. That's a start." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so large and work-roughened. "You're so beautiful when you almost smile. Your whole face changes, becomes something otherworldly." "I'm not beautiful." It wasn't self-pity, just statement of fact as Penelope understood it. She was plain, too serious, too locked inside herself to be anything approaching beautiful. "You are to me." Josiah said it with such simple conviction that Penelope felt her breath catch. "Every day I'm with you, I see more. The way you watch things carefully, like you're cataloging every detail. The way you touch things gently, like that puppy, like you're afraid of hurting something or like you're memorizing how it feels. The way you listen when I talk, really listen, not just waiting for your turn to speak." "Josiah, let me finish." His other hand came up so he was cradling her face between both palms. "I came to this town planning to get supplies and leave. I've been doing that for 10 years, never staying anywhere longer than necessary, never letting anyone get close. And then you were shot and didn't even flinch, and I thought, who is this woman who feels pain but doesn't cry out? I had to know, had to understand. And now that I'm starting to, now that I'm seeing beneath that wall you've built, I don't want to leave." Penelope's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palms. "You said you'd stay a week. It's only been 3 days. Forget the week. Forget the mountains. I want to stay here in this town with you for as long as you'll let me." "Why?" The question was almost a whisper. "Because when I'm with you, I don't feel so broken anymore. Because helping you find your joy is bringing back mine. Because I think maybe we were both lost until we found each other." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, their faces so close she could feel his breath. "And because I'm falling in love with you, Penelope Whitmore, and I don't want to fight it." The wall cracked wide open, and Penelope felt it shatter inside her chest. Emotion flooded through, overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Love and fear and hope and longing, all the feelings she'd kept dammed up for 23 years suddenly rushing free. But still, no sound came out. No laugh, no cry, no expression of the storm happening inside her. "I can't," she gasped, pulling back slightly, tears burning behind her eyes but refusing to fall. "I can't give you what you need. I can feel it, Josiah. I feel everything you're saying, but I can't show you. I'll disappoint you. I'll be this locked box forever, and you'll grow to resent me." "Look at me." Josiah's voice was firm, commanding. "I don't need you to laugh to know you're happy. I don't need you to cry to know you feel things. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you stand a little closer to me each day, in the way your hand relaxes in mine. You think you're hiding, but you're not from me. But the laugh. You said you wanted to hear me laugh. I do. But not because I need proof that you feel joy. Because I want to give you something you've never had. I want to be the one who breaks through that last barrier. And if it never happens, if you never laugh out loud in your entire life, that's fine too. Because just being with you is enough." A tear finally escaped, sliding down Penelope's cheek, and she felt as surprised as Josiah looked. She touched her face wonderingly, feeling the wetness. "You're crying," Josiah said softly, reverently. "I don't know how to stop." More tears came, and Penelope realized she was shaking. Not with sadness, but with the overwhelming sensation of finally expressing something real. Josiah pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her, and she buried her face in his shirt and cried silently while he held her. When the storm finally passed, Penelope pulled back, exhausted but somehow lighter. Josiah wiped her tears with his thumbs, his smile gentle. "See, that wall is already coming down." They didn't go back inside to the dance. Instead, they walked through Riverton's quiet streets, hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing. Josiah told her more about his life in the mountains, and this time he added details he'd left out before. The loneliness, yes, but also the beauty. The mornings waking to find elk grazing near his cabin, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, the peace that came from simplicity. "Would you show me?" Penelope asked. "Your home in the mountains." Josiah stopped walking, turning to face her. "You want to see it? I want to see where you're happiest, where you feel most yourself." "When would you want to go?" Penelope thought about her job at the schoolhouse, about Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, about the small life she'd built here in Riverton. None of it felt as important as this moment, as the chance to truly understand this man who was so determined to understand her. Soon, maybe in a few days when the weekend comes, we could make it a trip. Josiah's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." They made plans as they walked. Josiah would prepare everything, get the necessary supplies, make sure his cabin was ready for a guest. Penelope would arrange to take a few days away from the schoolhouse. It wasn't far, he assured her. 2 days' ride north into the mountains proper, to where the air got thin and the trees grew tall. At the boarding house, Josiah kissed her forehead gently. "Sleep well, Penelope. You too." She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Josiah, thank you for everything, for seeing me, always." The next day was Saturday, which meant no school. Josiah appeared at the boarding house after breakfast with a horse saddled for Penelope and his own roan ready to ride. Mrs. Patterson fussed about propriety and young ladies going off alone with men, but Penelope assured her they'd be back by evening, and that Josiah was perfectly respectable. They rode out of town, heading north, following a trail that climbed gradually into the foothills. The landscape changed as they went, the prairie grass giving way to scrub brush and then to pine trees. The air grew cooler and cleaner, scented with sap and earth. Josiah rode beside her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. They saw a herd of pronghorn in the distance, bounding across a meadow with impossible grace. An eagle circled overhead, riding thermals with outstretched wings. The world felt bigger up here, more alive. They stopped for lunch beside a stream that cut through a small canyon. Josiah had packed bread and cheese and apples, simple fare that tasted better somehow out here in the wilderness. Penelope sat on a flat rock, dangling her feet over the edge, watching the water rush past below. "When I was little," she said suddenly, "I used to pretend I was a princess locked in a tower. All the other girls played that game too, waiting for a prince to rescue them. But in my version, the door to the tower was never locked. I could leave whenever I wanted. I just couldn't figure out how. I'd stand at the window looking out, but I couldn't take that step through the door." Josiah sat down beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers. "And now I think maybe I've been carrying the tower with me. It was never a place. It was me. I'm the tower and the princess and the locked door all at once. So what do you need? A prince with a key?" Penelope turned to look at him, this mountain man with his long hair and strong hands and storm-gray eyes. "Maybe just someone willing to sit in the tower with me until I figure out I don't need it anymore. I can do that." Josiah took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm good at waiting. Mountains teach you patience." They continued riding after lunch, climbing higher into the hills. Josiah told her they weren't going all the way to his cabin today, just far enough to give her a taste of what lay ahead. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, the trees growing thicker the higher they climbed. Finally, they emerged into a clearing near the top of a ridge, and Penelope's breath caught. The view stretched for miles, mountains rolling away into the distance, peaks still capped with early snow. The sky seemed impossibly vast, an inverted bowl of blue unmarred by clouds. "This is why I stay," Josiah said quietly. "This feeling, like you're standing on top of the world." Penelope dismounted and walked to the edge of the clearing, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. She felt small here, but not in a bad way. Small in the way that made all her problems seem manageable, that put her locked tower into perspective. She was one person in this vast wilderness, and somehow that was freeing rather than frightening. Josiah came to stand behind her, close enough that she could lean back against his broad chest. His arms came around her waist, holding her gently but firmly, and they stood like that for long moments, just breathing together and watching the world spread out before them. "I love you." The words escaped Penelope before she'd consciously decided to say them, but once they were out, she knew they were true. "I don't know how to show it the way other people do, but I need you to know. I love you, Josiah Jensen." She felt his chest expand against her back as he took a deep breath. Then he turned her around to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers. "Say that again. I love you. Again. I love you." Penelope reached up to cup his bearded jaw, feeling the scratch of hair against her palm. "I love you, and it terrifies me because I don't know how to be loved in return. I don't know how to be enough for someone. You're already enough." Josiah bent down, his forehead touching hers. "More than enough. You're everything." When he kissed her, Penelope felt the last pieces of the wall crumble away. His lips were warm and gentle, asking rather than demanding, and she answered by pressing closer, her hands sliding into his long hair like she'd wanted to do since the first day she saw him. The kiss deepened, and Penelope felt something she'd never experienced before, a sense of completion, like she'd been walking around incomplete her whole life and had finally found the missing piece. They broke apart slowly, both breathing hard. Josiah rested his forehead against hers, his hands tangled in her hair. "Come home with me," he said. "Not today, but soon. Come see my cabin, spend time in the mountains with me. I want to share it with you. And after that, we figure out the rest together. Maybe you come back to Riverton sometimes to help at the school. Maybe I come down to town more often. Maybe we find a way to build a life that works for both of us. I don't have all the answers, Penelope. I just know I don't want to do this without you." "Okay," Penelope whispered. "Yes. To all of it, yes." They stayed in the clearing until the sun began its descent toward the horizon, then reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back to town. The trip down was quieter than the trip up, both of them lost in their own thoughts, but Josiah kept reaching over to touch her hand, her shoulder, as if reassuring himself she was real. In town, he walked her back to the boarding house as night fell. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on the porch, looking relieved to see them return. "Tomorrow?" Josiah asked at the door. "Tomorrow is Sunday. There's a church service in the morning. I'll be there." Penelope smiled, a small, soft thing but genuine. "You don't strike me as much of a churchgoer. I'm not. But you'll be there, so I will be too." True to his word, Josiah appeared at church the next morning, looking slightly uncomfortable in his best clothes but determined. He sat beside Penelope in the pew, his large frame making the wooden bench seem child-sized. Several people stared, unused to seeing the solitary mountain man at services, but Josiah ignored them all, his attention focused on Penelope. The Reverend preached about faith and miracles, about how God worked in mysterious ways. Penelope listened with half an ear, more aware of Josiah's presence beside her, the way their shoulders touched, the way he'd reached over to take her hand during one of the hymns. After the service, they walked through town. It was a beautiful autumn day, cool but sunny, the kind of weather that made Wyoming bearable. They ended up at the same creek where they'd had their first picnic, and Josiah spread his coat on the ground for Penelope to sit on. "I've been thinking," he said, settling beside her, "about the future, about what I want. And I want you. That's the only thing I'm certain of, but I know that's not fair to ask you to give up your life here without offering you something solid in return." Penelope tilted her head, studying him. "What do you mean?" Josiah pulled something from his pocket and Penelope's breath caught. It was a ring, simple and beautiful, made from what looked like silver with a small turquoise stone set in the center. "I made this," he said, holding it up to catch the light. "Last night, couldn't sleep again. Been carrying around the silver and stone for months, thinking someday I might have a reason to use them." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Penelope Whitmore, I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other less than a week. But I also know that I don't want to spend another day without you. Marry me. Come to the mountains with me, or stay in town if you prefer, or we'll split our time between both. We'll figure out the details as we go. Just say you'll be my wife." Penelope stared at the ring, then at Josiah, then back at the ring. Every practical thought told her this was madness. You couldn't fall in love in less than a week. You couldn't know someone well enough to marry them after 5 days. It was impulsive and reckless and completely illogical. But when had logic ever made her happy? When had being practical and cautious ever broken down the walls around her heart? "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Josiah's face was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the silver cool against her skin. Then he was kissing her again, gentle but insistent, and Penelope kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all the emotions she couldn't speak into the press of her lips against his. When they finally broke apart, both smiling, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. "When?" "Soon, as soon as we can arrange it." Penelope laughed, a small sound but a laugh nonetheless, surprised by her own eagerness. "I don't want to wait." Josiah pulled back, his eyes wide. "Did you just laugh?" Penelope touched her mouth in wonder. "I think I did, just a little. Do it again." "I can't just do it on command. It doesn't work that way." But Josiah was grinning now, his joy infectious. "Once is a start. We'll get to the full laugh eventually. I told you I'd make it happen." They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. They would marry the following Saturday, giving them a week to make arrangements. Reverend Thomas could perform the ceremony. It would be small, just a few witnesses, nothing fancy. After the wedding, they would spend a week at Josiah's cabin in the mountains, then return to Riverton to figure out their longer-term plans. Mrs. Patterson was shocked but supportive when Penelope told her the news. The schoolteacher was less pleased about potentially losing her assistant but congratulated Penelope nonetheless. The town buzzed with gossip about the quiet Whitmore girl marrying the mountain man after such a whirlwind courtship, but Penelope found she didn't care. Let them talk. She'd spent her whole life worrying about what people thought, trying to be normal, trying to fit in. For once, she was going to do exactly what she wanted. The week passed in a blur. Josiah spent his days preparing for their journey to the mountains after the wedding, buying supplies and making sure his cabin was ready. Penelope spent hers finishing up at the schoolhouse and packing her few belongings. They met every evening, walking through town or sitting on the porch of the boarding house, talking about everything and nothing. Josiah told her more about his past, about Sarah and the grief that had driven him west. Penelope shared stories from her childhood in Ohio, about the isolation and loneliness, about the doctors who'd tried to fix her, and the family who'd never quite understood her. They learned each other's histories, the wounds and scars that had shaped them, and in the sharing, Some of those old hurts began to heal. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the wedding, they went back to the ridge where Josiah had proposed. The autumn air was crisp and cold, hinting at the winter to come. They sat close together, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Are you scared?" Josiah asked. "Terrified," Penelope admitted, "but in a good way. It feels like standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. I could fall, but I could also fly." "I won't let you fall, that's a promise." "I know." She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "That's why I'm not running." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold. Penelope woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves, and found Mrs. Patterson already up and heating water for a bath. The older woman had softened considerably over the past week, touched by the romance of it all despite her initial reservations. "You're sure about this?" she asked as she helped Penelope into a simple cream-colored dress that one of the other boarders had lent her. "More sure than I've been about anything in my life. He's a good man. Rough around the edges, but good. I can see it in the way he looks at you." The ceremony was held in the church at noon. Penelope walked down the aisle alone, having no family to give her away, but it didn't matter. Her eyes were locked on Josiah, who stood at the front in clean clothes, his hair brushed back, looking nervous and happy and completely perfect. Reverend Thomas kept the ceremony short. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When Josiah slipped a second ring onto her finger, a wedding band to match the engagement ring, Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. This time, she let them fall, these tears of joy. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Thomas announced, and Josiah didn't need to be told twice. He pulled Penelope close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that they had an audience, not caring about anything except the woman in his arms who'd become his wife. There was a small reception afterward at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson had baked a cake, and some of the townspeople had brought food. It was simple but heartfelt, and Penelope found herself actually enjoying it, smiling at well-wishers, accepting congratulations with something approaching grace. At one point, she caught Josiah's eye across the room and he winked at her, and suddenly she felt it building. That laugh, the one he'd been trying to coax out of her all week. It bubbled up inside her chest, pressing against her ribs, demanding release. This time, she didn't fight it. The sound that escaped her was rusty and unpracticed, but it was real. A genuine laugh, loud enough that several people turned to look in surprise. Penelope clapped a hand over her mouth, startled by her own sound, but Josiah was already crossing the room to her, his face alight with joy. "There it is," he said, pulling her into his arms. "That beautiful sound, I knew it was in there." "I laughed," Penelope said wonderingly. "I actually laughed out loud." "You did. And you're going to do it again and again, I'll make sure of it." They left town that afternoon, heading north toward the mountains with everything they'd need packed on 2 horses. The journey took 2 full days, climbing steadily higher into the wilderness. They camped one night under the stars, huddled together by a fire, and Penelope had never felt so content. Josiah's cabin was exactly as she'd imagined it. Small and sturdy, built from logs he'd cut himself, situated in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. A creek ran nearby, its water clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. There was a small barn for the horses and a shed for supplies. It was isolated and simple and absolutely perfect. "Welcome home," Josiah said, lifting her down from her horse. "Home," Penelope repeated, testing the word. It felt right. He carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently inside. The cabin was a single large room with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs. shelves lined with supplies. It smelled like pine and wood smoke and safety. Josiah built up the fire while Penelope explored, touching things gently, learning the space. There were books on a shelf which surprised her. Carved figures of animals scattered around, evidence of his skill with a knife. A bearskin rug on the floor. Everything was neat and organized, the home of a man used to taking care of himself. "It's not much," Josiah said, sounding uncertain, "compared to what you might have had in Ohio or even in town." Penelope turned to him, crossing the small space to take his hands in hers. "It's perfect. You're perfect. This whole impossible week has been perfect." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and they stood like that for long moments, just holding each other. Then he was kissing her, deep and slow, and Penelope kissed him back, feeling heat build between them. They made love that night in the bed by the fireplace, gentle at first and then with growing passion. Josiah was careful with her, conscious of her inexperience, but Penelope urged him on, wanting to feel everything, wanting to break down every last barrier between them. Afterward, they lay tangled together under thick quilts, the fire crackling nearby, and Penelope felt more at peace than she'd ever thought possible. Josiah's hand traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she pressed closer into his warmth. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Yes." The word came easily, honestly. "I think this is what happiness feels like. I wasn't sure I'd ever know. Get used to it. I plan on making you happy every day for the rest of our lives." They spent a week at the cabin, learning each other and the rhythms of mountain life. Josiah taught Penelope how to track animals, how to read weather in the sky, how to move quietly through the forest. She taught him about the books she loved, reading aloud to him in the evenings while he carved small figures from wood. They cooked together, slept together, explored the wilderness together, and Penelope laughed. Not constantly, not easily, but more and more often as the days passed. Josiah seemed to make it his mission to coax that sound from her as often as possible, telling her stories or doing silly things, or simply being himself in all his rough, genuine, wonderful ways. One afternoon, he was trying to teach her how to fish in the creek. She kept losing the bait without catching anything, growing increasingly frustrated. And finally, Josiah just picked her up and threatened to throw her in the water. She'd shrieked with laughter, actually shrieked, and he'd looked so delighted that she'd kissed him right there standing in the creek with water soaking their boots. "I never knew," she said that night as they lay in bed. "I never knew life could be like this. That I could feel this much and show this much and it would be okay." "More than okay," Josiah corrected, pulling her closer. "It's everything." When they returned to Riverton after that first week, it was with the understanding that their life would be split between two worlds. They would spend summers in the mountains where Josiah was most comfortable, and winters in town where Penelope could continue helping at the school and where supplies were more readily available. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was theirs. They found a small house on the edge of town, close enough to be convenient but far enough to give Josiah space when he needed it. He took on work as a guide, leading hunters and adventurers into the mountains, making use of his knowledge and skills. Penelope continued at the schoolhouse, teaching children their letters and numbers. Life settled into a rhythm. During the week, they were part of the town, shopping at Henderson's store where Penelope no longer flinched at loud noises, attending church on Sundays, participating in socials. On weekends, they would ride out to the wilderness, spending nights under the stars or at the cabin, reconnecting with the wildness that had brought them together. Penelope bloomed under Josiah's love and attention. The laughter came more easily now, and sometimes even tears when she was moved by something beautiful or sad. She would never be the most expressive person, would always have that core of quietness that made her who she was, but the wall was gone. She could feel and show feeling, even if it looked different from how other people expressed themselves. "You did it," she told Josiah one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set. "You made me laugh daily, just like you said you would." "We did it," he corrected, lacing his fingers through hers. "You did the hard work of letting those walls down. I just gave you a reason to try." A year after their wedding, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of emotions. Joy, certainly, but also fear. What if she couldn't love a child properly? What if her emotional distance damaged them the way it had damaged all her other relationships? Josiah, as always, seemed to understand her fears without her having to voice them fully. "You're going to be an amazing mother," he said, his large hand spread across her still flat stomach. "You feel everything, Penelope. You always have. You'll feel love for this baby and you'll show it in your own way, and that will be enough. More than enough." Their son was born in the spring of 1879, a healthy baby boy they named Jacob. The birth was hard, attended by the doctor and several women from town, and when Penelope finally heard her baby cry, she cried too. Tears of exhaustion and relief and overwhelming love. Josiah held his son with a gentleness that belied his size, tears streaming down his own bearded face. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Thank you." Motherhood changed Penelope in ways she hadn't expected. Jacob became her everything, and she found that maternal love broke down the last of her reserves. She laughed at his antics as he grew, cried when he was hurt, expressed joy and frustration and tenderness with an ease that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. "See," Josiah said one evening, watching her rock Jacob to sleep while humming a lullaby. "I told you that you had it in you all along." They had 2 more children over the next 5 years. A daughter named Phoebe, fierce and wild like her father, and another son, James, quiet and thoughtful like his mother. The house that had once seemed adequately sized became cramped and loud with the chaos of family life. Josiah expanded it, building on an extra room for the children and a larger kitchen for Penelope. He thrived on the work, on providing for his family, on building something permanent with his hands. The mountain man who'd been content with solitude discovered he loved being surrounded by the noise and mess of children. They still spent summers at the cabin, the whole family now, teaching the children about wilderness and self-reliance. Winters were in town where the children could attend school and socialize with other kids. It was a good life, a full life, everything Penelope had never dared dream of. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Josiah took Penelope back to the ridge where he'd proposed. The children stayed with Mrs. Patterson, who'd become a beloved grandmother figure to them. It was autumn again, the season when they'd met, and the mountains were painted in gold and red and orange. 10 years, Josiah said, his arm around Penelope's waist as they looked out over the vast landscape. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "I can barely remember what life was like before you," Penelope admitted. "I was so lost, so locked inside myself, and you just decided I was worth saving. You saved yourself. I just gave you a reason to try." "We saved each other," Penelope corrected. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face. His hair was longer now, shot through with silver at the temples. Lines crinkled around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun and smiling. He was even more beautiful to her now than he'd been that first day. "You were just as lost as I was, Josiah, just in a different way. We found each other when we both needed it most. Lucky then, that I happened to be in that store when those bandits came through. Not luck, fate. Penelope pulled him down for a kiss, long and deep and full of 10 years of love and laughter and life together. When they broke apart, both smiling, she said, "Make me laugh." "What? Like you used to, in those first days. Make me laugh the way you set out to that very first day." Josiah's smile turned mischievous. He swept her up into his arms suddenly, making her shriek, and spun in a circle. "Like this. Josiah, put me down. Not until you laugh." He spun again faster, until they were both dizzy and laughing and holding onto each other for balance. Finally, he set her down, both of them breathless and grinning like fools. Penelope's laughter rang out across the ridge, free and joyful and loud. The sound she'd once thought was impossible had become as natural as breathing, at least when she was with him. "There it is," Josiah said softly, cupping her face between his hands. "That beautiful sound. Still my favorite thing in the world. I love you," Penelope said. "Today and every day. For making me believe I was worth loving, for showing me that being different wasn't being broken. I love you too. Always have. From the moment I saw you standing in that store like nothing could hurt you. Always will, until my last breath and beyond." They stayed on the ridge until sunset, wrapped in each other's arms, talking about their children and their plans and their dreams for the future. They spoke of growing old together, of watching their children grow and have families of their own, of all the years still ahead of them. As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in impossible colors, Penelope thought about the shy, silent girl she'd been when she first arrived in Riverton. That girl who'd never laughed out loud, who thought she was fundamentally broken, incapable of real emotion or connection. She thought about the mountain man who'd decided that making her laugh was a goal worth pursuing, who'd seen beneath her silence to the person trapped inside, who'd loved her not despite her differences, but because of them. And she thought about the life they'd built together, full of laughter and tears and joy and occasional sorrow, all the messy, complicated beauty of being fully alive. "Thank you," she whispered against Josiah's chest, "for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for making me laugh." "Always," he promised. "Every day for the rest of our lives." And he kept that promise. Jacob grew tall and strong like his father, eventually becoming a guide himself, leading expeditions into the mountains he'd grown up exploring. Phoebe married a schoolteacher from Cheyenne and moved south, though she visited often with her own growing family. James followed in his mother's quieter footsteps, becoming a teacher himself, patient and kind with students who struggled. Josiah and Penelope grew old together, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing down but their love never diminishing. They still spent summers at the cabin, though the climb became harder as the years passed. They still walked through Riverton hand in hand, still told stories to their grandchildren about how they'd met during a robbery and fallen in love in less than a week. "Tell us again about how Grandma never laughed," the grandchildren would beg, and Josiah would smile and weave the story one more time, embellishing slightly, making Penelope laugh at his exaggerations. "It wasn't quite like that," she'd protest, swatting his arm gently. "It was exactly like that. You were a silent mystery and I was determined to solve you." "Did you?" their oldest granddaughter asked once. "Did you solve the mystery?" Josiah and Penelope exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that couples who'd been together for decades could have without speaking. "I learned," Josiah said slowly, "that she was never a mystery to be solved. She was a person to be loved and understood and given space to bloom in her own time. And when she did, when she finally let herself laugh and cry and feel everything fully, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed." "Josiah taught me," Penelope added, taking his weathered hand in hers, "that being different didn't mean being broken. That love could break down walls I'd thought were permanent, and that laughter, real genuine laughter, was worth waiting for. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th, then their 40th. Each year was a gift, each day together a treasure. Josiah's body began to fail before his spirit, the hard years in the mountains taking their toll, but Penelope cared for him with tender devotion, just as he'd cared for her so many times over the years. On an autumn evening much like the one when they'd met, sitting on the porch of their house with the mountains visible in the distance, Josiah took Penelope's hand. "If I could go back," he said quietly, "to that day in Henderson's store, knowing everything that would come after, all the joy and struggle and life we'd build together, I'd do it all exactly the same. Even the parts where I couldn't show you how I felt. When I was still learning how to express myself, especially those parts, watching you discover your own capacity for joy, for laughter, for love, it's been the greatest privilege of my life." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You made me believe in second chances, Penelope. After Sarah, after all those years alone in the mountains, I thought I was done with life really living. Then you walked into my world, silent and beautiful and broken in all the ways I needed to see, and you made me want to try again." Tears streamed down Penelope's face, the tears that came so easily now after years of practice. "You saved my life, Josiah Jensen, in every way that matters. We saved each other. I told you that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I'll tell you every day we have left." They had 5 more good years together. 5 more years of watching their grandchildren grow, of summer evenings on the porch, of quiet mornings over coffee, of laughter shared and memories made. And then one morning, Josiah simply didn't wake up. He passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand still holding Penelope's, having lived a full and happy life. Penelope grieved deeply, but without regret. She cried at his funeral, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, mourning the loss of her partner but celebrating the life they'd shared. Jacob gave the eulogy, speaking of his father's strength and gentleness, his determination to make others happy, his profound love for his wife and family. "My father taught me," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion, "that love was a choice you made every day. That strength wasn't just physical but emotional. That the greatest adventure wasn't climbing mountains or tracking game, but opening your heart to another person fully and completely." After the funeral, after everyone had gone home, Penelope sat alone on her porch. She was 82 years old now, the quiet girl from Ohio having become a beloved matriarch of a large and loving family. She thought about Josiah, about their first meeting, about how he'd set himself the impossible goal of making her laugh and had succeeded beyond either of their wildest dreams. And sitting there in the gathering dusk, remembering his smile and his gentle hands and his storm-gray eyes, Penelope laughed. A full, genuine, joyful laugh that echoed across the yard, the sound he'd worked so hard to coax from her all those years ago. "There it is," she whispered to the empty air, to Josiah's spirit if it was listening. "That beautiful sound, still your favorite thing in the world." Penelope lived another 5 years, long enough to see several great-grandchildren born, long enough to ensure her children were settled and happy. She split her time between their homes, always welcome, always loved. And when she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep much as Josiah had, her family gathered to celebrate a life well lived. They buried her next to Josiah on a hillside overlooking the mountains they'd both loved, beneath a sky that stretched on forever. Jacob carved both headstones himself, simple and beautiful, much like the wooden figures his father used to make. The inscription on Penelope's stone read, She learned to laugh out loud, and the sound was beautiful. On Josiah's, he made it his mission to hear that sound, and he succeeded. Their story became part of Riverton's history, the tale of the mountain man and the silent girl who found each other and built something lasting. Parents told it to children, grandparents to grandchildren, always with the same message. That love could transform, that patience and determination could break down any wall, and that laughter was always worth waiting for. Years later, decades later, long after Penelope and Josiah had become part of the town's legend, couples would visit their graves on the hillside. They'd stand hand in hand, looking out at the mountains, and they'd make promises to each other. To love fiercely, to be patient, to see each other truly, to make each other laugh, and sometimes, on autumn evenings when the wind blew just right through the pines, people swore they could hear it, the sound of a woman's laughter, free and joyful and finally expressed. The most beautiful sound in the world, made possible by a mountain man who decided that love was worth fighting for, and a silent girl who'd learned that she was worth loving. Their story lived on, a testament to the transformative power of love, to the beauty of patience, to the miracle of two broken souls finding each other and becoming whole together. In a wild territory where survival was hard and life was often short, they'd built something eternal. A love that transcended silence, that broke down walls, that made laughter possible where there had been none before. And in the end, that was the greatest adventure of all.